In 2022, Fantasy Pros named me the world's most accurate quarterback ranker. And then last year, I did it again. Seems only fair I'd share my quarterback rankings for 2025 with you on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today I'm going through my quarterback rankings. These are for 4-point passing touchdown leagues. If you've got any questions, pop them in the comments below. If you need help with your leagues, you can ask me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. If you'd like to see my full rankings for all positions, you can go over to ffdfantasyfootball.com. My number one is without doubt Lamar Jackson. While I do love some Josh Allen, Lamar blew out the field last year, winning by 50 points over everyone else for fantasy football, as his best passing performance aligned with his first fully healthy season. His whole receiving and blocking cast returning means there's little reason to anticipate any imminent regression, but his rushing does always make him an injury risk, and an improved defense could lead to less shootouts and mean more Derrick Henry late in games, though I doubt it. Depends on your league as to where you take him, but I think anywhere in the third round onwards is totally reasonable in a non-superflex league, and in a superflex league, he is arguably the number one overall. Josh Allen is my number two quarterback. He's been a top two fantasy quarterback in each of the last 5 years and managed to perform last year despite the departure of Stephon Diggs and the regression of Dalton Kincaid. He's a true dual threat who performs regardless of the cast he's got around him. And that's just as well because he's got a particularly weak receiver core this year. James Cook stealing a whole heap of touchdowns as well. And last season, we saw his worst passing output since 2019 by over 500 yards. Amari Cooper's now at the door, and he definitely takes a hit in 6-point passing touchdown leagues. But because this is a 4-point passing touchdown ranking, I do have him at number two. But I do have a little bit of a gap from Jackson because of the risk of poor pass catches in Buffalo. There's nothing safer in fantasy than a rushing quarterback who's also an accurate passer on a high-scoring offense. That's why Jaden Daniels is my number three quarterback for this year, especially in 4-point passing touchdowns. I'd also expect a passing boost in year two, while I think the rushing floor probably remains. The addition of Deebo Samuel should help as well, but it is worth noting that last year, Daniels only had 34 total touchdowns and will need an increase if he's going to pay off for this cost in fantasy draft. Plus, the injury risk is always high with a rushing quarterback who's slight of build. Last year, Joe Burrow led the field with 300 more passing yards than any other quarterback and the most passing touchdowns, while also managing single-digit interceptions. The Bengals' defense remains a major weak spot, meaning Burrow will once again need to put the team on his back and carry them. The lack of a true workhorse running back should also mean a Burrow-centric offense led by Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. All three healthy seasons for Burrow have led to top 5 fantasy seasons. However, the low rushing floor means a low-scoring matchup could crater your fantasy week. Plus, an injury to Jamar Chase would also be a major issue for fantasy. Most quarterbacks become more pass-centric as they age, but Jalen Hurts still had the most rushing touchdowns last year and the third most rushing yards behind Lamar Jackson and Jaden Daniels. Obviously, the way they manage the tush push is going to be an issue for this year, but Hurts has become a more accurate passer last season. It didn't really seem to hurt his rushing floor. He's had 4 straight seasons with at least 600 rushing yards and continues to have double-digit rushing touchdowns. He finished as the quarterback 6 in points per game, despite injuries to all 3 major pass catchers for the Eagles. The downside, of course, is that Saquon Barkley has taken a lot of touches that would have gone to Hurts, particularly within the red zone. This will be even more significant this season. Hurts' 18 passing touchdowns were the fewest of all quarterbacks who played at least 15 games last season. For that reason, Hurts is the last on this tier for me. Having said that, when you're drafting quarterbacks, if you're wanting to take a quarterback early, for me, it makes sense to see which of these 5 guys lasts the longest and then take them with your next pick. I would rather be taking the cheapest of these guys rather than reaching for one because there's really not that much gap between Hurts and Allen, or arguably even between Hurts and Jackson. Who'd have thunk it? Leaving the Browns has given Baker Mayfield a new lease of life. A top 5 fantasy quarterback in 2024 who gets a big boost in 6-point passing touchdown leagues thanks to his 41 passing tutties last season. This was supplemented by doubling his previous best rushing total, and now he gets another true receiving weapon in Emeka Egbuka, along with, hopefully, the return of Chris Godwin. Now, to be fair, he's not a big-name quarterback who has seen plenty of seasons of mediocrity, and his 71% completion percentage is bordering on unsustainable. Plus, Tampa's play calling can rely on their dual running backs at times, meaning we could see a drop in production for Mayfield. Having said that, they did just bring in a new wide receiver, so I do think they want the passing game to be central to their offense this season as well. Patrick Mahomes is number 7 for me, and he and Mayfield are in a tier by themselves. I would be taking either of these guys a couple of rounds after the top 5, but well ahead of anyone else. Mahomes, of course, has multiple QB1 finishes on his resume, with over 300 rushing yards, also the norm. An improved O-line this year and the return of Rashee Rice and Hollywood Brown should see a more explosive offense. He's still arguably the most naturally gifted passer in the league, and that always increases his floor. Now, the downside for Mahomes remains the Chiefs' strong defense, which often leads to the Chiefs just doing enough some weeks and cruising into the playoffs. Plus, the fall-off in Travis Kelce's play removes a big catalyst to Mahomes' elite fantasy performance. He's also struggled to stay fully healthy of late, though an improved O-line should hopefully make a difference there. I would be considering taking he and Mayfield around the 6th round or so, or you might find that they don't make it there. It does really depend on your league settings. My number 8 is perhaps surprisingly Caleb Williams. I really like his upside this year. I feel like he's one of those players who has the biggest opportunity to have a big jump from season 1 and therefore give you a significant bargain on draft day. There have been massive improvements to his O-line, and he's added Colston Loveland and Luther Burden to his receiving core. He's got a high rushing floor with a second-year bump likely, given how rocky he looked at times in 2024. Now, we do know there's downside. We're yet to see Williams really show the quality that is necessary for a top 10 fantasy finish. And any new offense is always a risk for fantasy, with Ben Johnson known to be a bit run-heavy. Having said that, their only real top running back is DeAndre Swift, and their defense is not anything special. So I do think they're planning on leaning on Williams this year, and that is likely, especially if the offense is improved, to lead to really good fantasy outcomes for the second-year first overall pick. I have Williams and Jared Goff very close for fantasy. Goff slides down to 9 for me, but he and Williams are tied. Goff is more of a safe option, and I think that Williams has a little bit more upside. Goff also has a little bit more variability on a weekly basis, but it is worth noting he's had 3 consecutive top 10 fantasy finishes with improvements across the board with each season. The arrival of Isaac Tesla gives further hope while the team remains a true playoff contender who will be among the league's highest scorers. The downside, of course, is that he does have the odd implosion and has a very low rushing floor, making him hard to trust on a weekly basis. The Lions rely heavily on their run game, meaning easy wins sometimes don't help Goff in fantasy. I would be taking either he or Williams around the 8th or 9th round, depending on your league settings. And again, if you're unsure when to take these guys, remember, I do offer personalized rankings for your specific league settings. Hit me up on my socials if you're interested in any of those. Kyler Murray slides in at number 10. The former number 1 quarterback is another year removed from injury, and that should see his game improve relative to last season, which was a little bit rocky at times. He remains a true dual threat quarterback who'll benefit from second-year receiver Marvin Harrison Jr.'s likely step forward. The downside, of course, is this is a naturally run-heavy offense that lacks depth in receiving playmakers. Anytime you've got Michael Wilson as your wide receiver too, that is very scary. Of course, they do have Trey McBride to fill in, and that does help out. Murray had a lot of bust weeks last season, making him hard to trust for fantasy despite the big performances in between. Plus, they've got one of the league's best, just quietly, running backs in James Conner, and they do lean on him. If they can get him the ball through the air, though, that's going to help both Murray and Connor, and I think that could be a step they take this season. I like Murray, but he is a little bit behind Williams and Goff for me because he does have so much natural downside. Now, I do admit that 11 is a little bit low for Bo Nix, given how he went last year, and given second-year quarterbacks often make a big jump after their rookie season. Nix also gets the addition of a viable receiving tight end in Evan Ingram and some more wide receiver help from day 2 of the draft. Plus, he rushed for over 400 yards last year, making him safer on a weekly basis. For me, though, the massive downside is the improved rushing offense, which could take away from the quarterback's fantasy scoring. He may also get found out this year with teams having the whole offseason to work out his weaknesses. Last year, to me, felt a little bit like a fluke. We've seen a lot of these guys come in and have one good season. We saw it with Daniel Jones a few years ago. We've certainly seen it. We saw it with Mac Jones in his first year. We saw it with Geno Smith having one very good year for fantasy. It feels like that could be the story here with Bo Nix. And for that reason, I'm not willing to take him inside the top 10. And I feel like I'm going to miss out on him in the majority of leagues. My number 12 is Justin Fields, and I feel like you could argue taking him even higher than this, given he has massive upside. He's a true rushing weapon who is a viable fantasy starter with his legs alone. He's had over 1,000-yard rushing seasons before. He's playing behind an improved O-line with talented young weapons around him. There's no threats to his starting role this time either, and that makes him a lot safer. The downside, of course, is his underwhelming party with very little receiving depth behind Garrett Wilson. So many question marks mean he's far more risky than most. But if you're starting to hit the middle rounds and you're thinking quarterback, you can definitely do worse than Fields because you can afford to take a risk on a player when you're not paying up for one. I really like Fields as a mid-round pick if you're feeling good about your offense and you know that there are going to be other quarterbacks you can take as a backup to Fields, because I would not want him as the only guy on my roster. Feels weird having someone who's never played in the NFL at 13 for me this year, especially given I wasn't even particularly high on JJ McCarthy last year. But he is entering an elite offense, which made Sam Darnold the QB8 despite the lack of TJ Hawkinson. And I don't think Darnold is a particularly special passer. So that means this offense should elevate McCarthy sufficiently. He now gets a wide receiver 3 improvement in Ty Felton and an incredibly strong offensive line as they made a lot of additions there in the offseason. This team is built for McCarthy's success, and I feel like there's a real chance that he could outplay this QB 13 ranking. Plus, you can get him way later than this in drafts as well. The downside, of course, though, is obvious. He's totally unproven and essentially entering his rookie season in a high-pressure situation where half a dozen bad games may lead to his benching. Ultimately, he's just a Justin Jefferson injury away from being a fantasy non-entity. But with how much he's costing you, you can essentially bring him in as your second fantasy quarterback and feel really good about him. He's a little bit more of a risk in Superflex, but ultimately in fantasy, you should be trying to win your league. And McCarthy is the kind of guy that can definitely win your league, given the situation he's going into. I will have a lot of shares. Dak Prescott slides in at 14, and we know that he seems to be good every second season, which will definitely help him out here. He's finished top 4 in fantasy in 2 of his last 3 healthy seasons, which seems amazing. Plus, the arrival of George Pickens gives CeeDee Lamb a true pass-catching complement for the first time. Running back additions suggest this is going to be a pass-first approach for the Cowboys, and I think they're going to need to. Now, the downside, of course, is that Dak has been very injury-prone lately, leading to a drop in rushing output and regression in his passing. The lack of running back talent may also expose Dak at times, as his passing quality can be a little underwhelming sometimes. I'm a little bit nervous about Dak, but in this range, you're really not paying that high for him, and there is a lot of upside here, given I really don't see the Cowboys being able to run the ball overly effectively as much as they might like to. I think this is a situation where as the season goes on and they start to fall out of playoff contention, you may see that they get forced to rely on the pass. However, The complement to that issue, of course, is that it might be that if Dak gets injured, there's absolutely no reason to force him back out there, and he's not very useful for fantasy if he's sitting on your bench. Brock Purdy slides in at number 15, and he is the clear leader of the team with his big new contract. He'll hopefully have a healthier receiving room this year, with CMC also providing a fantastic receiving asset out of the back room. A big bump in rushing output last season helped him out as well. Deebo Samuel being gone isn't ideal, but I don't think it's going to hurt him too much because I expect to step up from Ricky Pearsall and I expect George Kittle to be healthier and more helpful this season. Problem is, he has awful depth at all three receiving positions, and that's a major concern given how often 49ers are injured. Purdy just isn't particularly good in general either and needs elite players around him to succeed. So if we see injuries like we did last season to the likes of McCaffrey and or Kittle, all of a sudden I think that Purdy could really struggle for fantasy. That lack of floor means that he has a lot of risk attached to him, and I don't think he has the upside of many of these guys given his lack of rushing floor. Justin Herbert is my quarterback 16. The Jim Harbaugh system seemed to suit Herbert last year as he improved as the season went on and showed impressive accuracy. Second-year receiver Ladd McConkey is joined by 3 rookies and better pass-catching running backs. There were also over 300 rushing yards last season for Herbert, which really improves his weekly floor. But the downside is obvious. This is a naturally conservative offense that gives the QB a low ceiling on a weekly basis. They brought in 2 very good running back, or at least 2 very fresh running backs, which hurts the team's passing output. It's been 4 years since Herbert finished in the top 10 for fantasy, and I find it hard to see that happening here, even though I think this offense could be quite good. I think that's going to be mostly driven by the likes of Hampton and Harris on the ground, rather than massive passing output by their quarterback. CJ Stroud was very disappointing last year, which is why he's down at 17 for me, but a haul of new weapons, including Christian Kirk, a pair of day 2 receivers, and a quality receiving back in Woody Marks should certainly help. He looked good in his rookie season, did CJ Stroud, and he showed his potential as an NFL passer. Plus, he has a sufficient running floor, but the downside is obvious. The O-line changes do not look like an improvement, and they struggled last year. Plus, his awful sophomore season could be a sign of things to come. We also don't know what to expect from these new receivers. They are unproven compared to the likes of Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell. For that reason, I'm really not overly interested in Stroud. I know that he does have top 10 upside, but I can't see him being a true league winner, given you're not getting a massive discount on him. Jordan Love is a former top 5 fantasy quarterback, another one on that list of players who had one boob season and then came back to earth. He now gets the addition of a first-round receiver in Matthew Golden and should be fully recovered from the elbow injury that hampered him down the stretch last year. The problem is this is a naturally run-heavy offense with no reason to expect change there after it worked pretty effectively for most of the regular season. Love regressed in most meaningful metrics and had major drops in passing output and rushing totals, and yet the team was more successful. That leads me to expect that we'll see more of the same strategically this year, and that is bad for Love for fantasy. Trevor Lawrence has a history of solid fantasy production and a good rushing floor in an offense that will definitely need to score points to counteract their mediocre defense. The addition of star rookie Travis Hunter and better interior linemen should help. Plus, their 2024 struggles were mostly down to injuries. Also, wouldn't be surprised if Brian Thomas takes another step forward after a big rookie season. Of course, the problem for Lawrence is that he's looked worse in each of his last 3 seasons. Losing Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, and Gabe Davis gives a sizable hole to fill with 2 unproven entities. Plus, this offense tends to focus on their mediocre run game a little bit too much. And the addition of Tuden only suggests that might happen even more this year. It's really hard to see Lawrence being anything more than a QB2 this year. Another guy that you should really only be considering in Superflex is Tua Tagovailoa. Top 10 fantasy quarterback back in 2023. Tua looks good when healthy and has electric receiving options. He'll need to score a lot of points as well, thanks to an awful defense. The downside, though, is that Tyreek Hill is aging and Jaden Waddle was awful last season. Plus, the team can lean too heavily on its run at times, with Tua never being one of those involved in the rushing action. Tua is honestly just one head knock away from retirement at this stage, making him a scary dynasty asset. But even in redraft, which we're talking about here, in Superflex, I don't know that I particularly want him because you really want your Superflex quarterbacks to be reliable. In a 1 QB league, unless it's a very deep league, I don't know why you're touching Tua. So there's very few situations where Tua actually becomes a viable option. At 21, it's Anthony Richardson, and there is a lot of upside here. His rushing makes him a real fantasy asset in the mold of a young Lamar Jackson or prime Justin Fields. The Colts have worked hard to give their young quarterback some strong receiving options, with Tyler Warren a huge upgrade over the weird committee of tight ends they've used in the past. The downside is really obvious, though. Richardson has looked awful when passing the ball, and his inexperience has regularly shown through. He only had about a dozen games when he came into the NFL, and he's hardly played since coming in. Losing the starting job will be a constant risk, assuming he can even beat out Daniel Jones in training camp, and I think that is a big if. Having said that, he does have significantly more upside than Daniel Jones. That's why I'm willing to take him higher. In a super flex league, I think you're risking it taking him here as his second quarterback. You would definitely want a viable third option as well, even if you end up taking Daniel Jones and someone else because you've got a deep bench. You can get Richardson a lot later than the QB21, though, which means you could get a whole lot of value. Matthew Stafford gets an elite wide receiver duo in Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams, with Terrence Ferguson a positive addition at tight end, plus Tyler Higbee will presumably finally be back healthy. Stafford is an Iron Man who rarely misses games due to injury, though his play does suffer at times as he tends to grind through it. The downside, of course, is that he offers no rushing upside as well and has just one top 14 fantasy finish in the last 7 years. The Rams lean very run-heavy through Kyren Williams, particularly around the goal line. So this is very much just a super flex or 2 QB option, or maybe a good best ball asset later in drafts. Drake May is a highly talented passer entering his second season with improved pass catches. He has a high rushing floor with over 30 yards a game last season, but the downside with the Patriots is ever present. He has weak pass catches led by aging veterans and unproven youngsters. Plus, this could be a run-heavy offense under Mike Vrabel, especially given the strongest offensive weapons are the running backs. I'm generally staying away from May in redraft, but I still acknowledge that he is a very talented passer and could bring something later in the season or in the future in dynasty and keeper leagues. I hated the drafting of Michael Penix last year. I thought it made no sense given they already had Kirk Cousins and paid him a heap of money. I do understand it was a good future option, but it felt like they might be able to challenge last year and they really handcuffed themselves. Ultimately, I think possibly they just shouldn't have signed Cousins to so much money, as Penix proved to be a talented passer surrounded by talented pass-catching weapons. He should be better in his second year now that this is clearly his offense. The downside, though, is he offers no rushing output and hasn't looked great at this stage as a passer. The Falcons lean on their run game, and rightly so, given they've got Bijan Robinson, and that will hurt Penix's weekly floor. I do think the Falcons will be pretty good this year, but I'm not convinced that Penix is going to be good for fantasy. Sam Darnold gets a big hit moving from the Vikings to the Seahawks. And while Geno Smith was a fantasy asset at times with this offense, Sam Darnold is arguably a better player too, but he was the QB8 last season. That was on the Vikings offense. That's not the case here. This team is not capable of putting up those same points. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett have been replaced by 31-year-old plus players in Cooper Kupp and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. That's a major downgrade, which could leave the Seahawks relying more on their run game. The interior offensive line is also one of the worst in the league, even with the addition of Gray Zabel. I don't like this situation at all for Darnold. I think it's disappointing that he's moved here. I understand why he did, because he couldn't stay at the Vikings, but this is going to be very bad for fantasy, I suspect. Bryce Young's in at 26, and he had an impressive bounce back in 2024. He didn't look like a star, but he was at least a functional starting quarterback with a good rushing floor, and that's better than what we saw from him in the past. The Panthers added a first-round receiver in consecutive years, which should really help with this resurgence. This really feels like Axe Tepid making sure that that massive trade he made is going to work. Will it? We'll have to see. The Panthers lent pretty run heavy last year, and Young isn't inclined to air it out. Young receivers on this team are very unproven, with Liggett struggling to get the ball in effective ways. McMillan has yet to show anything in OTAs. Plus, Adam Thielen is nearing retirement, and I'm not convinced by Jalen Coker. Young has a very, very low floor for fantasy on a weekly basis, and I would not be touching him outside the deepest of leagues or as a super flex bench desperation option. As I mentioned earlier, Geno Smith was bizarrely a top 6 quarterback back in 2022 who has consistently outproduced expectations since his return to a starting NFL role. He has a surprising rushing floor for an older quarterback and gets young, explosive receiving weapons in Ashton Genty, Brock Bowers, and 3 rookie wide receivers to add to Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker. The downside, of course, is that he is ultimately more of a game manager who produced with a fantastic wide receiver group last year, but now it's Myers, Beck, and Tucker as his starters. That's a big drop-off. The Raiders may well lean very run-heavy to protect Geno, and I can't see him being anything more than a top 18 or so quarterback. Having said that, if you're desperate and you're getting him as your QB2 or even QB3 in a super flex league, I think that makes a lot of sense and the value is certainly possible. Cam Ward is a good decision maker who can scramble his way out of trouble and into fantasy points. He gets a strong O-line, which should give him passing opportunities and low expectations, mean little chance of being benched when Will Levis is the backup and was awful last year. The issue here for Cam Ward, of course, that he is in one of the league's worst receiving groups with an average age of 31, backed up by day 3 rookies and an underwhelming tight end group. The team will likely be run heavy again to protect their rookie first pick. Aaron Rodgers is a proven passer who can still sling it even though he's in his 40s. He's made it work with weak receiving cores before, but there's a total lack of quality receivers outside DK Metcalf and Pat Frymouth, and I expect that we're going to see the Steelers lean on their run game and defense very heavily this year. That massively caps Rodgers' ceiling, given he's not going to give you anything with his legs, and he's unlikely to get the opportunity to do much with his arm. From a guy likely to retire at the end of this season to a guy entering his first NFL season, and Tyler Shough is my number 30 quarterback, and that's because I expect him to start ahead of Spencer Rattler, and I have a little bit more confidence in him and a little bit more upside in him than the guys like the Giants and the Browns. He's the most pro-ready of the rookie quarterbacks, though you would expect that a draftee who'll turn 26 this season would be. That makes him older than 11 of the league's starters, which is insane. He's got solid job security given his quality and experience when compared to Spencer Rattler. The downside, though, is that this offense is a mess with Chris Olave and an aging Alvin Kamara the primary receiving weapons. There's also big question marks over whether Shough is NFL quality, and there's even more question marks over whether he can offer anything even in Superflex this season. Plus, there is always going to be the risk of him losing his starting job if the Saints struggle this season. Now, I'm just going to shout out a couple of guys outside the top 30 who I think are at least worth mentioning in deeper Superflex leagues. My number 31 is Daniel Jones. Very much likely to be a backup to Anthony Richardson, though I do think there is a chance he gets the starting job. And if he does provide some upside. We've seen him have top fantasy seasons before, and I think this is another situation where he could at least be solid. So I'm willing to put him on my bench, especially if I also got Richardson for cheap and I have a deep bench. It does make sense to take both in a deep super flex league. Russell Wilson's in there at 32 for me. I think he's probably the starter initially for the Giants, but I find it very hard to see him making it through the season. I think the Giants could be a little bit better than expected this year, but I don't think that's going to mean much for Wilson for fantasy. 33 for me is Joe Flacco, who I think is probably the Browns starter, but that's going to depend on what happens out of OTAs and training camp. Flacco has looked good at times, but last year he looked pretty mediocre with the Colts, and I think he's probably aging out. This is not exactly our Browns team that is anything special. Having said that, we did see Jameis Winston become a fantasy weapon temporarily last season. Perhaps that can be Flacco. Who knows? There's at least some upside there, but a very, very, very low and likely floor. Jackson Dart slides in at 34 for me. And I mean, he's a rookie. He's unlikely to start initially. You're going to have to be very patient with him. I don't really see much point in rostering him personally. And I know a lot of people will probably be taking him before you even consider him. And if that's the case, rightly so. The last guy I will mention is Shedeur Sanders. He's in at number 35 for me. And in a redraft league, I'm not touching him. I very much doubt he's going to be the starter week one. And even if he is, how much value is he offering? You'd have to be in an extraordinarily deep league. I'm talking like over 20 teams before he becomes a viable bench option. And that's all we've got for my quarterback rankings for 2025. That's for redraft with 4-point passing touchdowns. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. Plus, if you need help with your league, I will put together personalized draft rankings for you. Every league is different. And I have found that when people have draft rankings that are specified to their league, they're more likely to win. I've had a heap of people who signed up last year for a very small cost and they won their league for the first time. So if you'd like to add your name to that list, hit me up on Instagram or Twitter, or you can email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. I'll be back to break down all the running backs in my next video. I look forward to seeing you guys then.